I started out the month with Little Miss Sunshine. This is a movie about cars and family, so it's basically the Fast and Furious. But unlike most of those movies, this is actually really good. Everyone in the family is a little bit messed up in their own way, which leads to a really interesting dynamic between each character, with unique relationships between each family member, which are elevated exponentially by the performances of the cast full of great actors. I think an interesting part of this movie is its themes of letting go, be that of ideas, positions, or ambitions. A lot of characters go through arcs by letting go of things. It's a good movie and definitely worth watching. 7 was horrifying and it was incredible. If there's one thing that I love, it's Jesus, Christian literature, and Weezer, and this movie has one of those things. The concept of a serial killer basing his murders around the 7 deadly sins is incredible and opens up so many avenues to tell a great story, and this movie absolutely delivers on that potential. The psychological duel that goes on between John Doe and the detectives was the best thing that I've seen since watching Death Note, and it's really satisfying to see Somerset and Mills discover more clues and inch closer towards the murderer while John is already 2 steps ahead. I thought the relationship between Somerset and Mills was a great time to watch play out. I think that Mills is a kind of representation of the changing world that Somerset is living in. Detective Somerset is kind of like Sheriff Bell from No Country for Old Men. They're both trying to adjust to this new world, but I think that the key difference between the two is that Somerset actually thinks he can try and fix it, even though he's out of his element. His disgust with the world that he lives in is apparent, and he's obviously taken aback by society's degeneracy, but unlike John Doe, he sees some good in it, and he thinks that it can be redeemed. I think that Mills is a great foil to Somerset because unlike him, he's impatient, he loses his temper often, so Somerset has to be able to reel him back into control. Now, when you add John Doe to the equation, it ends up being a power struggle between Somerset and Doe to see who can corrupt him or keep him on a righteous path. Or, relating back to Mills representing the world, Somerset is kind of like a Christ figure, and despite seemingly being a devout Christian, John Doe is basically the Antichrist. I haven't even talked about how disturbing this movie is. Even the opening credits freaked me out. The movie does a great job at showing just enough to give you an idea of what kind of horrors John is committing, but when it does show you things like the sloth victim, it's just as messed up as when the murders are simply described. Then there's the cinematography, which is just unreal sometimes. You've got this shot where Mills has a gun to his head, or the close-up of John's face where he has this serene expression and he almost looks like a statue. There are shots in the film that are almost too good that I just sat and stared at them for a minute. If you haven't seen this movie, watch it, and if you have seen it, watch it again because it is absolutely remarkable. Killers of the Flower Moon is a great film. The film comes out swinging with the opening scene doing a great job at showing what the movie is going to be about. The first shot is of someone lifting up a pipe during some kind of ceremony and the people are mourning their dying culture, talking about how their children will speak a new language and that they will have to practice a new religion, and that got me thinking. No matter what you think of how natives in the US have been treated, if you have good common sense, you'll feel sympathy for the people in this situation, all thanks to this intimate moment about people losing a part of them, about their children losing a part of them, and knowing that their children will be different from them. And I think that's already something that's hard to do, especially without being preachy, and that's a testament to this film's quality. But then there's every other great thing about it. Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio did a great job as usual, but Lily Gladstone, who I've never seen in anything before, brought what I think was the strongest performance. She has an understated presence in every scene that she's in that makes her stand out and surpass her co-stars. The relationship between her and DiCaprio's characters is so interesting to watch. The relationship seems so devoid of love, but it's hard to tell if they actually do love each other, and the slow unraveling of trust between them is so great to watch. The cinematography was great, and I think the beauty of some shots were well contrasted by the grisly murders that are committed throughout the film. The murders are treated very well in the movie, never feeling over the top or dramatized. It feels real. I think that this isn't Scorsese's best film, and that it felt a little bit too long towards the end, but it didn't overstay its welcome, and the ending was absolutely worth it. I think that between this and Oppenheimer, 2023 was a pretty good year for historical movies, and this is definitely among the best movies that came out this year. Then my cousin and I went to go see the Five Nights at Freddy's movie. I've never played Five Nights at Freddy's, and I'm not familiar with the lore at all, so I went into this without any biases for the movie, but maybe seeing it with rose-tinted glasses on this is the right way to see it. I wasn't expecting a great movie, I was instead expecting more of a fun movie, and FNAF is not that. It's unnecessarily bleak most of the time when they could have done a lot more with the source material. It's a movie based on a game about a haunted Chuck E. Cheese that is super popular with kids, and they didn't use that premise to its best potential. It easily could have been made into a campy comedy with horror elements, but instead they decided to go completely for horror. But they couldn't even take that very far because they had to get that PG-13 rating. And even then, the horror was mostly pretty bad because instead of setting up well-planned scares, it just jump scares you a bunch of times, and instead of being scary, it's just jarring. I think that the best part of the movie was the scene when Matthew Lillard's character was in the rabbit suit. He was entertaining, the acting was full of life and energy, and above everything else, it was fun. If a bad movie can make itself fun, then it saves its quality and makes it into something worth watching. If the rest of the movie did what this scene is doing, it would be pretty good. It just tends to take itself too seriously. They brought on good actors for the movie, but they're just held back and made to play wooden characters. Also, don't get me started on the ghost kids in this movie. Every time I saw one of them, I was just counting the seconds until they were off screen, especially that one ginger kid. This movie had a lot of potential to be a good time, but it just fell flat on its face. If I was a big fan of Five Nights with Frederick, I'd think it's really cool that a game that I liked was being made into a movie. I've even heard about people like me that don't know things about the pre-existing lore of the game that were confused about the events that transpire in the movie, like one of the robots going to someone's house. It never explains this, it just expects you to know about the rules of the universe. So the movie was made for people who were already fans of the franchise. I will give it this, though. I thought the practical effects for the animatronics were really good, and it had MatPat in it, and he said, "It's just a theory," so 10 out of 10. Akira and Blade Runner walked so the rest of the cyberpunk genre could run, and I think that this might have led to a lot of Japanese stuff being in later pieces of media in the genre. This movie definitely wasn't my favorite of the month, but I think it was good nonetheless. I think the strongest part of the film was the stuff with the biker gangs. I wasn't super into the psychic stuff, but I was interested in how the new abilities that came with his new power corrupted the main character and ruined his relationship with his friends, and eventually led to his own ambiguous fate. I think that the story is stretched a little thin, and it doesn't have enough time to develop most of the characters. That said, some of the best world building was the passive looks into the world, like the frequent explosions or the random people making out in the street. It illustrates how self-destructive and hedonistic Neo-Tokyo is. I don't really understand why the main character tried to kill all of his friends. Like, they seemed like a pretty close group, and he's just a little jealous of Kaneda and was a little insecure about himself. So the power probably corrupted him, but I think his moral turn is way too fast. I recently saw a video where it showed behind-the-scenes footage for this movie, and seeing how meticulous and time-consuming the work behind this film was is incredible. Other than that, I don't really have a ton to say about this movie. If you like this kind of genre, I'd recommend it. Before I'd even watched Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, I had the impression that it was a bit of a weird movie, and that ended up being true for the most part. But if you can get past the more bizarre bits, this movie is really good. The editing is unlike anything I've ever seen before and does a great job at translating the visual style of a comic book and video games into a film, and it shows how much love went into making the movie. The writing is also really good, and I think the characters speak in a way that is witty but doesn't get annoying. It kind of reminds me of something out of a Wes Anderson movie. I think each character is very unique and likable in their own way, with the exception of Scott, who is the most off-putting character in the whole film. This movie's sense of humor is also great in my opinion, with hilarious bits like the vegan police, or even just more subtle things like reaction shots from people watching fights, or throwaway lines like,
That's actually hilarious.
I think a lot of these small things made this movie a lot better, and I like it a lot. You should watch it. I ended the month with Kingdom of Heaven. I hadn't seen any movies about the Crusades before this, but I think this is one good example of the kind of stories that you could tell with this time period. It does a good job at showing that many of the Crusaders weren't in it for God or anything like that, but for personal gain, which I thought was a good deconstruction of common ideas of Crusaders. My biggest issue with the movie was how one-sided it was. It really depicts most Crusaders, and especially the Knights Templar, as barbarians that would murder any Muslims that they come across, and Muslims as noble warriors that did no wrong, when in actuality both sides did bad things like killing civilians. I thought the performances were all right across the board. Edward Norton did a great job without even showing his face, so that was pretty cool. I think the relationship between the Christians and Muslims was really interesting to watch, and it tells us much more about the conflict between each faction, much better than the battle sequences. The fights in this movie are really engaging too. They don't really hold back with how brutal medieval combat was, and it made the battles feel real and like they had a lot of stakes. I started to feel the runtime toward the end and didn't think the conclusion was that good, but other than that, I'd recommend this movie. So yeah, that's what I watched this month. Thank you for watching. If you have any movie recommendations, please leave them in the comments, and until then, I'll see you next time.